This is Serenity, a plane that was created to learn more about motors on the tip of a wing. Serenity has been through a lot lately.
She was a good soldier. She taught us everything we needed to know about wingtip motors.
Let me explain. Daniel from RCTestFlight and I have a pretty cool mission planned for next year, which will use a solar-powered aircraft. But before we decided on a final design, I wanted to run some tests. To this end, I built Serenity, a small flying wing aircraft that would allow me to assess the benefits between placing the motors at the end of a wing versus the more traditional winglets, where the motors are placed mid-wing. I was hoping to learn whether the change in motor placement changes the efficiency or energy consumption of the aircraft. Electric propulsion is becoming practical for full-scale aircraft, and the small size of electric motors makes various placements around the aircraft practical, including motors at the tips of the wings. The claims about how much wingtip motors can increase efficiency are pretty compelling, and I wanted to see what the hype was about. To understand how putting a motor at the tip of a wing might increase efficiency, we need to know a little bit more about lift. One of the types of drag created when any aircraft is flying is called induced drag and is the direct result of generating lift, the force created by the wings that allows the plane to stay in the air. I would tell you how lift is generated, but actually that is quite the subject of debate, and some random internet dude is not going to solve that discussion anytime soon. But just trust that lift makes the plane fly and induced drag is the result. What there is little debate about is that induced drag reveals itself in vortices being generated at the tip of a wing as it passes through the air. At lower speeds, induced drag is the dominant form of drag on an aircraft. That means that reducing the size of the vortex at the wingtip indicates you have also decreased the induced drag of the aircraft. The primary means of decreasing induced drag is by increasing the aspect ratio of a wing, or more simply put, by changing the difference between the wingspan and the width, or chord, of the wing. This explains why the most efficient aircraft you encounter have incredibly long and narrow wings. So what does this have to do with motors turning propellers on wingtips? Well, after a little bit of reading, a lot of experimenting, and then more reading, it turns out quite a bit. This is where Serenity comes in. After spending some time on the computer creating the design, I began constructing a prototype that later could easily be converted between the two configurations, motors on the wingtips and motors closer towards the middle. Here's the complete mess as usual. Trailing edge done. Alright, we're gonna pop some servos in, pop some wires in for the motors, maybe pop a GPS in. Make some room in the fuselage for a battery and electronics. Alright, quick update of what we got here. I got the motor wires put in. You can see they're just kind of terminated right here. I'm going to put the motor here and then connect these wires with the wires coming out the motor. And you can also see I have a piece of plywood in here. When I'm done with the wingtip motors, and I'm going to do the motors on the wingtip first, that's the first experimentation, I'm going to section the wing right there and then add a wingtip back on that's the same size but without the motor pod. So that's why I have that piece of plywood there. You can see the motor wires are behind the high point of the wing, which is right where the spar is. The air is going to be separated at that point, so it's already going to be turbulent. So that's really not going to affect the aerodynamics to have that there, especially after I fill it in, and it'll be almost perfect, but not quite. Versus if I put the motor wires in front of the spar where the air is not separated, I would separate the air there, and that would cause more drag by separating the air earlier. So that's a quick tip for the aficionados. Is there anything else? Nope, just time to start gooping and spackling it so I can get the Kevlar on. Yep. Then it was time for the very first test flight.
Oh my god!
From the second it left my hand, I could tell it was unlike anything I had ever flown before. It was so smooth. Digitally smooth. Buttery smooth. Smooth like a perfectly tuned quadcopter, which is not normal for a fixed-wing aircraft. I used the same autopilot that had been on my split-rudder plane from a previous build, and it required no changes to stability settings from the split-rudder plane. I'd like to claim that I spent a whole day tuning the autopilot to perfection, but honestly, it flew right off the bat, basically perfect, no changes needed. RD-plane is amazing, look it up. Alright, so it stalled right as I pulled up to flare for landing, knocked off the motor, got a little dirt in the motor, so I'm gonna get some compressed air on the way home. But damn! This thing is sick! Before we got to the real efficiency testing, I wanted to make one final test flight, this time with some smoke grenades attached to the wingtips. I bought this little Estes rocket for another project, but wouldn't you know, the rocket tube fits the smoke grenade that we're going to use for the visualization perfectly. So I'm just going to glue these on the wingtips, fair them in a little bit to make them more aerodynamic, to not mess up the flow as much, to get better vortices. And we shall see what it looks like in the AM. I decided to go with the Enola Gay smoke grenades, and after fixing them to the plane, we headed out to a dry lake bed to see what the wingtip vortices might look like.
Alright, babe, we are ready to rock and roll.
It looks pretty cool. Normally the vortex coming off of a wing spins inwards. When reviewing the footage from the smoke tests, it was immediately apparent that the wingtip motor was creating a vortex rotating outwards. A little further downstream, the counter-rotating vortex would merge with the normal vortex again. So what did this mean for efficiency? It seems to indicate that the counter-rotating vortex was effectively lengthening the wingspan, essentially increasing the wing's aspect ratio, which you may remember is the span of the wing in relation to its chord, and thus its efficiency.
So we're back at the shop and we have a total and complete mess, but it's kind of cool looking. And the motor still spins very smoothly, so we'll clean it up and see what we got left. If not, we'll replace the motors and the props.
Now we could get to the real efficiency testing for Serenity.
Here we are initializing. There's the plane. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Get it.
Over the next few days, with the plane still in the wingtip motor configuration, I flew the same 33-mile course over a period of 1 hour and observed very consistent results when recharging the battery. In fact, each charge put back in nearly the same amount of energy into the battery pack, within 0.2% each time. I did not get in as many tests as I would have liked, but the results were consistent at least.
And today we do have a little bit of a breeze going. Unlike yesterday. I don't know, what is that, 2-3 miles an hour?
So I decided to leave the motor wires accessible. I'm not cutting back as far as I thought I was going to. In case the results are pretty substantial, 5-10%, then I may be revisiting and doing further experimentation to further validate this thing. If there's not, then I probably won't revisit it, but we'll see. Anyways, the motor mounts are getting done, and hopefully I'll have this all fixed up to continue testing tomorrow.
Next, it was time to try the second configuration. I switched to central motors with winglets and it was back to more efficiency testing. Enjoy the views. Of course, I needed to bring the project full circle with some vortex visualization of the wing with the winglets on. And so it was back to the dry lake bed to get some sweet video. And this happened. One of the winglets had broken, but fortunately there was a store nearby and I was able to get some super glue, get the fin fixed, and we were back in the air. For a second or two.
Is Serenity okay? Is she repaired though?
I would probably just start over. No, that's a cracked spot.
So what did you learn from this?
I learned that a GoPro Hero Max placed 5 inches above the center of mass of a flying wing is a little bit too high for the aircraft to compensate for, even with a fantastic autopilot, if I don't have the motors on the wingtips to handle massive yaw inputs. So that was a pretty specific lesson.
Which basically just means that because of the added weight in the wrong location, it flew itself straight into the ground. Not ideal. The same thing was actually happening on the airplane with wingtip motors. However, the wingtip motors were able to keep the airflow attached at the wingtips and also prevent the plane from rolling over because the wingtip motors, being further out, had better leverage to keep the plane straight as it tried to stall and spiral in. So testing was cut short, but what did we learn? Well, between the two versions of Serenity, I learned that placing the motors on the wingtips only gave a 1 to 2% increase in efficiency over winglets. Now this is probably within the margin of error, given our non-super scientific conditions, but this was a little surprising as many projects and companies claim up to 15% or more in energy savings of wingtip motors over traditional configurations. Given this result, I dove deeper into some of the published research on the subject. The conclusion was that the larger the propeller in relationship to the wing and the harder the propeller is working, the larger the efficiency gains. The new Bell 280 Valor is probably the peak example for maximizing wingtip propeller efficiency. I now have a better understanding of why the company called Eviation, with their prototype named Alice, may have switched from motors at the tip of the wing to winglets, given that the propellers were very small in relation to the length of the wing. The Eviation Alice was definitely my favorite all-electric aircraft coming to the market, and after my little experiment, I love the new direction they have chosen. Having done all this testing with Serenity, I now have a much clearer understanding of when to use motors at the tips of wings. Sometimes it is for efficiency, sometimes it is for control, and despite not getting the results I expected, I am more excited about wingtip motors than before I started the project. RCTestFlight and I can now make a more informed decision about what configuration to use for our solar project. Stay tuned and find out in a future video what direction we decided to go and why. And don't worry, I'm not holding out on you, we still haven't decided. Have a great day, I hope you learned something from this project, I know I sure did.